The rain against Dr. Morgan's office windows sounded like fingernails tapping against glass. Impatient, insistent, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give. I'd been staring at the same spot on her bookshelf for the past 10 minutes, a worn copy of The Body Keeps the Score, wedged between volumes on cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. My body had been keeping score for 28 years, and I was finally here, in this beige-walled room that smelled faintly of lavender and clinical detachment, trying to figure out what the hell the final tally was. "Marcus," Dr. Morgan's voice cut through the white noise in my head. "Where did you go just now?" I shifted in the leather chair that had become as familiar as my own skin over the past 6 months. Every Thursday at 4 p.m., same seat, same view of her degrees hanging perfectly aligned on the wall behind her desk. Same feeling of being gently dissected by someone who'd probably heard worse than whatever mess I brought through her door each week. "Sorry," I said, though I wasn't really. Just thinking. About? About how I'm paying you $200 an hour to sit here and feel like a fraud. About how David's voice is still in my head telling me I'm too broken to fix. About how some days I wake up and for exactly 3 seconds I forget he's gone, and then the relief hits so hard it makes me feel guilty for feeling relieved. "The rain," I lied. Dr. Morgan, mid-50s, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that never seemed to have a strand out of place, eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward slightly. Not enough to invade my space, just enough to let me know she was still here, still listening, still waiting for me to stop running from whatever truth was trying to claw its way out of my chest. "The rain," she repeated, not a question but an invitation to elaborate. I looked back at the window. The downpour had started 20 minutes into our session, turning the world outside into a watercolor painting left out in the storm. People hurried past on the sidewalk below, hunched under umbrellas and newspapers, everyone desperate to get somewhere dry and safe. "It's loud," I said finally. "Louder than your thoughts?" There it was, that gentle but relentless way she had of pushing me toward honesty. 6 months of Thursday afternoons, and she still managed to catch me off guard with questions that felt simple on the surface, but hit like depth charges. I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Nothing's louder than my thoughts." "What are they telling you right now?" "That I'm wasting your time, that this whole therapy thing is just an expensive way to postpone dealing with the fact that maybe David was right about me, that maybe I am too much work, too damaged, that I should probably leave soon," I said instead. "The rain's getting worse." Morgan glanced at the antique clock on her desk. 5:20 p.m. We'd gone over by 20 minutes, which meant she'd either forgotten to watch the time, unlikely for someone as precise as her, or she'd made a conscious choice to let the session run long. Both possibilities made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't name. "We can stop here if you'd like," she said, but something in her tone suggested she thought we were just getting somewhere. "Though I'm curious about your impulse to leave when we start talking about what you're thinking." I stood up before I could stop myself, the familiar flight response kicking in like muscle memory. "I just don't want to keep you." "Marcus." She didn't raise her voice, but there was something in the way she said my name that made me pause halfway to the door. "You're not keeping me. This is exactly where I choose to be right now." The words hit differently than they should have. Maybe it was the way she said choose, like my being there mattered enough to warrant a decision. Maybe it was the exhaustion that had been building in my bones for months, the weight of carrying conversations I was too afraid to have. Or maybe it was just that for once someone was telling me I wasn't a burden, and I was too tired to argue. I sat back down. "Good," Dr. Morgan said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Now, what were you really thinking about while you were looking at that book?" The session ran until almost 6 p.m. By the time I finally gathered the courage to leave, or ran out of excuses to stay, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle that caught the light from the street lamps just beginning to flicker on. Dr. Morgan walked me to her office door, something she didn't usually do, and paused with her hand on the doorknob. "I'm proud of you for staying today," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." I nodded because speaking felt like too much effort. She opened the door and I stepped into the hallway that connected her office to the building's main corridor. The lights were dimmer out here, most of the other offices already closed for the evening. My footsteps echoed off the polished floors as I made my way toward the elevator, keys already in my hand, mind already shifting toward the drive home and the leftover Thai food waiting in my refrigerator and the 3 episodes of a Netflix series I'd been using to avoid thinking. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the wall next to the elevator, one shoulder pressed against the faded wallpaper, head down, dark hoodie pulled up despite being indoors. Headphones hung around his neck, the cord disappearing into his pocket. Early 20s, maybe 23 or 24, tall and lean in that way that suggested he hadn't quite grown into his frame yet. Dark hair curled slightly at the edges of his hood. I might not have looked twice. There were other offices in this building, other reasons someone might be waiting in the hallway at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, but something about his stillness caught my attention. He wasn't checking his phone or looking at his watch or doing any of the restless things people do when they're waiting. He was just there, present in a way that felt deliberate. The elevator dinged and he looked up. Christ. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and intense in a way that made my breath catch. There was something familiar about his face, though I was certain I'd never seen him before. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, mouth that looked like it was always on the verge of saying something sardonic. But it was his eyes that held me, not curious or friendly or any of the things you'd expect when a stranger catches you staring, just knowing, like he'd already made up his mind about something. The elevator doors opened, but neither of us moved. Going down? His voice was lower than I'd expected, rough around the edges like he'd been smoking or hadn't spoken in a while. Yeah, I managed, though my feet felt rooted to the worn carpet. He stepped aside to let me enter first, and I caught a hint of his scent as I passed. Cigarettes and something clean like soap or shampoo. He pressed the button for the lobby without asking which floor I needed, somehow knowing I was headed to the same place he was. The elevator was small and old, the kind that shuddered slightly between floors and made you wonder about the last time it had been inspected. We stood on opposite sides, but the space between us felt charged in a way that made me hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the fact that his hands were shoved deep in his pockets like he was trying to keep them from doing something he shouldn't. Long day? He asked as we passed the 3rd floor. I looked at him, trying to read the expression on his face. Was this small talk? Was he actually curious? Or was there something else behind the question, something that suggested he knew exactly where I'd been and what I'd been doing for the past 2 hours? Something like that, I said. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like the suggestion of one. Dr. Morgan runs late sometimes. The words hit me like ice water. He knew. Not only did he know I'd been in therapy, he knew with whom. Which meant either he'd been listening at doors, unlikely given that Dr. Morgan's office was soundproofed, or, "You know Dr. Morgan?" I asked, though something in my chest was already connecting dots I didn't want to connect. You could say that. The elevator dinged for the lobby and he stepped out first, not looking back to see if I was following. "She's my mother." I followed him into the lobby on autopilot, my brain trying to process this information and failing spectacularly. Dr. Morgan had never mentioned having children. Not once in 6 months of sessions had she referenced a son or a family or anything beyond the professional mask she wore so perfectly, I'd sometimes wondered if she went home and hung it on a hook by her door. He was already halfway to the building's front entrance when I managed to find my voice. "Wait." He stopped, but didn't turn around. Just stood there with his hands still in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched under the dark hoodie. "I didn't know she had," I started, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? I didn't know she had a son who looks like he stepped out of a film noir and has the kind of eyes that make you forget how to breathe. "She doesn't talk about me much," he said without turning around. "Professional boundaries and all that." There was something in his tone, not bitter exactly, but not neutral either. like he was used to being the thing his mother kept separate from her work, the part of her life that didn't fit into the carefully organized world of therapeutic relationships and clinical diagnoses. I'm Marcus, I said, because standing in the lobby of a professional building having a conversation with someone's back felt ridiculous. I know. Now he did turn around, and that almost smile was back. She doesn't talk about her patients much either, but walls are thin and I pay attention. Something about the way he said, "I pay attention," made my skin prickle. Not in a threatening way. There was nothing menacing about him, nothing that suggested danger in any conventional sense. But there was an intensity there that felt like standing too close to a fire, warm and compelling and potentially destructive if you weren't careful. "And you are?" I asked. "Careful," he said like he'd read my thoughts. Then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to make me wonder if he was going to answer at all, "Ethan." Ethan. The name fit him somehow. Simple, classic. The kind of name that suggested someone who didn't need to announce themselves to take up space in a room. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." It felt strange saying his name like I was crossing some kind of line I couldn't see but could definitely feel. "Is it?" he asked, and there was something almost playful in the question, like he was testing me. I stared at him, trying to figure out what the hell was happening in this conversation and why every exchange felt like it had three different meanings. "Is it what?" "Nice to meet me." He took a step closer, not enough to invade my personal space, but enough that I had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. "Most people find me complicated." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I didn't know how to unpack. There was something about the way he said it, not like a warning, more like a statement of fact, like he was giving me information I might need later. "I don't know you well enough to have an opinion," I said, which was both true and completely false. I'd known him for less than 10 minutes, and I already had about 15 different opinions, none of which I was prepared to examine too closely. "Fair enough." He pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen, though I had the feeling it was more for show than because he actually needed to check the time. "I should go, but Marcus?" The way he said my name made something tighten in my chest. "Yeah? She's good at what she does, my mom. Don't give up on it just because it's hard." Before I could ask what he meant, or how he knew I'd been thinking about giving up, he was walking toward the door, pushing through the glass entrance and out into the drizzle that had started up again. I watched him go, noting the way he moved with the kind of unconscious grace that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, even if he wasn't comfortable with much else. He didn't look back. I stood in the lobby for another 5 minutes, staring at the door he'd walked through and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Dr. Morgan never mentioned she had a son, but now that I'd seen him, it was like I couldn't unsee him. Those storm cloud eyes, the way he'd said my name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth, the casual way he'd referenced knowing things about me that felt too intimate for a stranger to know, professional boundaries and all that. By the time I made it to my car, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the parking lot slick and reflective under the streetlights. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine, trying to shake the feeling that something significant had just shifted in my carefully constructed world of Thursday appointments and controlled emotional excavation. The next week, I arrived early for my session, not intentionally. I'd been having trouble sleeping, and the alternative to coming here was sitting in my apartment staring at the walls and thinking about David, about the things he'd said during our last fight, about the sound the door made when he slammed it for the final time. So I'd gotten in my car an hour before I needed to leave and driven the long way to Dr. Morgan's building, taking surface streets instead of the highway, stopping for coffee I didn't need and gas I didn't need, anything to keep moving and keep the silence at bay. I parked in the same spot I always used, third row, closest to the building entrance, and sat with the engine running and the radio playing quietly. The building looked different in the late afternoon light, older somehow, the brick facade weathered and worn in a way that suggested decades of people walking through those doors carrying secrets they were finally ready to share. That's when I saw him again. Ethan was sitting on the front steps of the building, cigarette between his fingers, wearing the same dark hoodie from the week before or one identical to it. His head was tilted back, eyes closed, face turned toward the weak October sun like he was trying to absorb whatever warmth it had left to offer. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that made me want to sit and watch him for reasons I wasn't ready to name. As if he could feel me looking, his eyes opened and found my car immediately. No searching, no scanning the parking lot, just a direct line from his gaze to mine like he'd known exactly where I was the entire time. Our eyes met through my windshield and he didn't smile, didn't wave or nod or make any gesture of recognition, just looked at me with that same intensity from the week before, like he was seeing something I didn't even know was there. I turned off the engine. I had 20 minutes before my appointment, and there was nowhere else I needed to be, nothing else I needed to do except sit in my car and pretend I wasn't watching Dr. Morgan's son smoke a cigarette on the steps of a building full of therapists. But pretending felt exhausting, and I was already tired, and there was something about his stillness that made my own restlessness feel less urgent. He finished his cigarette and stubbed it out on the concrete step beside him, then stood and walked toward the building entrance. But instead of going inside, he stopped and looked back at my car. Waited, like he was giving me a choice about something. I got out of the car. The walk from the parking lot to the building steps felt longer than it should have, like crossing some kind of threshold I hadn't noticed the first time. Ethan had settled back into his original position, elbows resting on the step behind him, legs stretched out in front of him. Up close, I could see details I'd missed from the car, the worn spots on his jeans, the way his hair curled slightly at his temples, the fact that his eyes weren't just gray-green but had flecks of gold that caught the light when he moved. "You're early," he said without looking at me. "So are you." I stopped at the bottom of the steps, unsure whether the invitation to approach extended to actually sitting down beside him. I'm always early, one of my many charming personality quirks. He gestured to the step beside him. "You can sit if you want. I don't bite." I sat, leaving enough space between us that we weren't touching, but close enough that I could smell cigarettes and that same clean scent from the elevator. This close, I could see that his hoodie was actually navy blue, not black, and that there were small holes near the cuffs where he'd worried the fabric with his fingers. "Nervous habit?" I asked, nodding toward the frayed cuffs. He looked down at his sleeves, then back at me. "Among others." We sat in silence for a while, watching people walk past on the sidewalk. Rush hour was starting, and the street was busy with commuters heading home from jobs that required them to wear suits and carry briefcases and look like they had their lives together. I wondered what they saw when they looked at us. Two men sitting on the steps of a nondescript office building, not talking, not really looking at each other, just existing in the same space like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why didn't your mom ever mention you?" Ethan was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, like he was sharing something he didn't usually talk about. "Because I'm not part of that world," he said. "The therapy thing, the professional thing. She's Dr. Morgan there, and Dr. Morgan doesn't have a 24-year-old son who dropped out of graduate school and spends his afternoons smoking cigarettes on office building steps." There was something raw in his voice, something that suggested this separation between his mother's professional and personal lives wasn't entirely his choice. I wanted to ask more questions about graduate school, about why he was here if he wasn't part of her professional world, about the way his hands had tightened into fists when he talked about not belonging, but something in his expression warned me away from pushing. "What were you studying?" I asked instead. "Psychology." He laughed, a sound with edges sharp enough to cut. "Ironic, right? Why'd you drop out?" "Same reason you're here, probably." He turned to look at me fully for the first time since I'd sat down. Sometimes understanding why people do things doesn't make it any easier to live with the things they've done. The words hit harder than they should have, probably because they came too close to truths I wasn't ready to examine. I thought about David, about the patterns we'd fallen into that I could analyze and dissect and understand completely but had never been able to break. About the way knowing something was destructive didn't make it any less compelling. That's pretty cynical, I said. Is it cynical or is it realistic? Ethan's eyes had gone darker somehow, the gold flecks less visible. You tell me, how's therapy working out for you so far? I started to give him the standard answer. It's a process. These things take time. Dr. Morgan is helping me work through some difficult patterns, but something about his directness made the platitudes die in my throat. I don't know, I said instead. Some days I think it's helping. Other days I think I'm just paying someone to listen to me complain about the same problems over and over again. And today? I looked at him, trying to read his expression. Was this genuine curiosity, or was he testing me somehow? Today I think I'm early because I was afraid if I went home first I wouldn't come back. Afraid of missing the appointment or afraid of having it? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't know the answer. Or maybe I did know and I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Both, I said finally. Ethan nodded like this made perfect sense to him. Fear's honest, at least, better than pretending everything's fine when it's not. You sound like you know something about that. I know something about most things that are bad for you. He stood up and brushed off the back of his jeans, then looked down at me. You should go up. She's probably expecting you. I checked my watch, 4:55 p.m. I had 5 minutes, which meant he was right, but I found myself reluctant to leave. There was something about this conversation, about the way he talked about difficult things without trying to fix them or minimize them, that felt more real than most of the interactions I'd had in months. Will you be here when I get out? I asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded needier than I'd intended, like I was asking for something I had no right to ask for. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than I wanted him to see. Probably not, he said. But I'm here most Thursdays around this time. He walked up the steps toward the building entrance, then stopped and turned back. Marcus? Yeah? Don't run away from whatever she's trying to get you to talk about today. Trust me, it doesn't get easier by avoiding it. Then he was gone, disappearing through the glass doors and leaving me sitting alone on the steps with 5 minutes to get to my appointment and a head full of questions I didn't know how to ask. The session with Dr. Morgan was different that day, more focused, like she could sense that something had shifted in my willingness to engage. We talked about patterns, the ones I'd learned in childhood, the ones I'd repeated with David, the ones I was still repeating in small ways that kept me trapped in cycles. I could see but couldn't seem to break. Change is uncomfortable, she said at one point, leaning forward slightly in her chair. It requires us to let go of familiar ways of being, even when those ways aren't serving us anymore. What if I don't know how to be any other way? I asked. Then we practice, small steps, one choice at a time. I thought about Ethan's words. Don't run away from whatever she's trying to get you to talk about, and made a choice to stay present instead of retreating into my head the way I usually did when conversations got too close to things that hurt. David used to say I was too much work, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. That I needed too much reassurance, too much attention, that loving me was exhausting. Dr. Morgan was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing not just what I'd said, but how I'd said it, the way my voice had gotten smaller, the way my hands had curled into fists in my lap. How did it feel to hear that? She asked. True, I said without thinking, then caught myself. I mean, it felt true, whether or not it actually was. What do you think now? I considered this, trying to separate David's voice from my own thoughts, his version of me from who I actually was. I think maybe needing things isn't the same as being too much work. And maybe someone who loves you shouldn't make you feel like loving you back is a burden. That sounds like insight. It sounds like something I know intellectually but don't actually believe yet. Dr. Morgan smiled, and for the first time in 6 months, it didn't feel like a professional smile. That's exactly where most real change begins. When the session ended, I walked to the elevator feeling different somehow, lighter maybe, or just less afraid of the weight I was carrying. The hallway was empty this time. No dark hoodie, no storm cloud eyes, no unexpected conversations that left me feeling like I'd been turned inside out and examined. I was almost disappointed. The next Thursday, I arrived at my usual time and found the front steps empty. No Ethan, no cigarette smoke, no opportunity for another one of those strange, intense conversations that seemed to reveal more about me than I'd intended to share. I told myself the disappointment I felt was ridiculous. I barely knew him, and what I did know suggested he was exactly the kind of complication I didn't need in my life right now. But as I walked through the lobby and waited for the elevator, I found myself listening for his voice, looking for any sign that he might be somewhere in the building. The session went well. Dr. Morgan and I talked more about boundaries, how to recognize them, how to maintain them, how to know when flexibility was healthy versus when it was just another form of self-abandonment. I left feeling like I'd accomplished something, like the work we were doing together was finally starting to create real changes in how I moved through the world. I was halfway across the lobby when I heard my name. Marcus. I turned around to find Ethan standing near the building's front desk wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater instead of his usual hoodie. He looked older somehow, more put together, though the intensity in his eyes was exactly the same. "Hey," I said, walking back toward him. "I didn't see you outside." "I was upstairs, had some things to take care of." He gestured toward the elevator. "How was your session?" The question felt more personal than it should have, like he was asking about something private and intimate rather than just making conversation. I found myself wanting to give him a real answer instead of the polite deflection I would have offered anyone else. "Good," I said. "Actually good, not just good because that's what you're supposed to say about therapy." "That's progress." "Yeah, I think so." I paused, studying his face. "You look different today." "Different how?" "Less," I searched for the right word, "less like you're trying to disappear." Something flickered across his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. "That's very observant of you." "Is it accurate?" "Maybe." He shoved his hands into his pockets, a gesture I was starting to recognize as his default when conversations got too close to something real. "Do you have somewhere you need to be right now?" "Home, eventually, but not urgently." I wasn't sure why I was being so honest about my lack of plans, my lack of anywhere important to be. "Why?" "There's a coffee place around the corner. Good coffee, terrible service, no one bothers you if you want to sit and think." It wasn't quite an invitation, more like information he was offering in case I wanted to do something with it. I should have said no. Should have made some excuse about needing to get home, about having work to do, or calls to return, or any of the 100 small lies people tell when they want to avoid complications. Instead, I said, "Lead the way." The coffee shop was exactly as advertised. Good coffee served by a barista who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Dim lighting that made everything feel slightly underground. Mismatched furniture that suggested no one had put much thought into the ambiance. It was the kind of place that existed for function rather than atmosphere. Somewhere you went when you needed caffeine and wanted to be left alone. We ordered at the counter, black coffee for him, something complicated with too much milk for me, and found a table in the corner where the lighting was even dimmer and the sounds from the street felt farther away. "So," Ethan said after we'd been sitting in silence for several minutes, both of us ostensibly focused on our drinks, "what's your story?" I looked at him over the rim of my cup. "That's a pretty broad question. Start wherever you want. I'm not in a hurry." There was something about the way he said it, patient but genuinely curious, that made me want to tell him things I hadn't planned on sharing. Maybe it was the setting, intimate and dim and separate from the rest of the world. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, focused but not demanding. Or maybe it was just that I'd spent so many months carefully parsing out pieces of my story in Dr. Morgan's office that the idea of telling it differently, to someone who wasn't professionally obligated to listen, felt almost revolutionary. "I was in a relationship for 3 years," I said finally. "It ended badly about 8 months ago. I started therapy because I was tired of feeling like I was drowning all the time." "Are you still drowning?" "Some days, less often than before, though." Ethan nodded like this made perfect sense. What made it end badly? I took a sip of my coffee, buying myself time to figure out how to answer. The easy answer was that David had cheated, that I'd found text messages on his phone and confronted him, and he'd moved out 3 days later. But the real answer was more complicated, tangled up in months of small cruelties and larger betrayals and the slow erosion of trust that had started long before I found evidence of another man. He made me feel like loving him was my job and I was bad at it, I said eventually. The word surprised me. I'd never put it quite that way before, not even in therapy, but sitting across from Ethan in the dim light of this anonymous coffee shop, it felt like the truest thing I'd said in months. That's fucked up, Ethan said simply. Yeah, it was. I looked at him, noting the way his jaw had tightened slightly when I'd spoken. What about you? What's your story? My story is that I have terrible taste in people and excellent instincts about coffee shops. It was clearly a deflection, but I let it pass. He'd listened to me talk about David without judgment or unwanted advice, and the least I could do was return the favor if he wasn't ready to share. The coffee is good, I agreed. I come here a lot, when I need to think or when being at home feels too much like being trapped. Do you live with your mom? God, no. He laughed, but there was something strained about the sound. I have an apartment about 10 minutes from here. Small, kind of depressing, but it's mine. And you spend your afternoons on the steps of her building because... Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. When he finally looked up, his expression was more open than I'd seen it before, vulnerable in a way that made something in my chest tighten. Because I'm trying to figure out how to have a relationship with her that isn't about what I should be doing with my life, he said. And because sometimes I like to sit somewhere and watch people who are actually trying to get better instead of just complaining about how hard everything is. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. It was the kind of admission that felt too intimate for two people who barely knew each other, the kind of thing that should have made me uncomfortable or eager to change the subject. Instead, it made me want to lean closer. Is that what you think I'm doing? I asked. Trying to get better? I think you're scared of trying to get better, which is different from not wanting to try at all. His words hit like a physical thing, accurate and uncomfortable and impossible to dismiss. I set down my coffee cup harder than I'd intended, the sound sharp in the quiet of the coffee shop. You don't know me well enough to make that kind of assessment, I said. No, he agreed. But I know what it looks like when someone is carrying around guilt that isn't theirs to carry. And I know what it sounds like when someone talks about a relationship like it was their fault for not being good enough instead of the other person's fault for being cruel. I stared at him, feeling exposed in a way that was both terrifying and oddly liberating. How do you know that? Because I've been there. Different circumstances, same guilt. Before I could ask what he meant, he was standing up, pulling bills out of his wallet and dropping them on the table. I should go, he said. But Marcus? Yeah. Stop apologizing for taking up space. You're allowed to need things. You're allowed to want things. And you're especially allowed to expect the people who claim to love you to actually act like they do. He was halfway to the door before I found my voice. Ethan, wait. He stopped but didn't turn around. Will I see you next week? Do you want to? The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. The smart answer was no. The safe answer was no. Ethan was Dr. Morgan's son, which made him off limits in ways I couldn't even begin to calculate. He was younger than me, clearly dealing with his own complicated relationship with therapy and family and whatever had made him drop out of graduate school. He was intense and perceptive and had a way of looking at me that made me feel simultaneously seen and terrified, all of which should have made the answer obvious. Yes, I said. This time he did turn around. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted, become more alert. Then I'll see you next week, he said. After he left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, staring at my phone and pretending to read emails while actually replaying every word of our conversation. There had been something different about tonight, something that felt less accidental and more intentional than our previous encounters. Like we'd crossed some kind of line from strangers who happened to cross paths to people who were actively choosing to seek each other out. The thought should have worried me more than it did. The following Thursday arrived gray and cold, October finally giving way to the kind of weather that made everyone hurry a little faster down the sidewalks and pull their coats a little tighter. I'd spent the week thinking about Ethan more than I wanted to admit, replaying our conversation in the coffee shop, wondering what he'd meant about carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry, anticipating Thursday afternoon in ways that had nothing to do with therapy and everything to do with the possibility of seeing those storm cloud eyes again. Saul. Oh. Oh. Part 2. I arrived 15 minutes early for my session, which should have been my first warning that my motivations had shifted into territory I wasn't ready to examine. The building's front steps were empty, just gray concrete and the lingering smell of cigarettes from other people's nervous habits. I sat down anyway, pulling my jacket tighter against the wind that cut through the space between buildings like it had somewhere urgent to be. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through law school and 3 years with David and 8 months of learning to live alone, kept insisting I should go inside. Wait in the warm lobby like a normal person. Stop looking for complications in the form of a 24-year-old with trust issues and eyes that saw too much. The other part of my brain, the part that had been growing louder ever since that conversation in the coffee shop, wanted to know what would happen if I stayed exactly where I was. I stayed. 10 minutes passed, then 5 more. A woman in a business suit hurried past, talking loudly into her phone about quarterly reports and deadline extensions. A delivery truck double-parked across the street, hazard lights blinking while the driver unloaded boxes that looked too heavy for one person to carry. Normal Thursday afternoon things happening to normal people who probably weren't sitting on office building steps waiting for their therapist's son to appear like some kind of emotional reckoning they couldn't name. I was starting to feel ridiculous when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind me. "You're early again." I turned around to find Ethan approaching from the direction of the street, no cigarette this time, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a black peacoat I hadn't seen before. His hair was damp from the light mist that had started falling while I'd been sitting there, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd been sleeping about as well as I had. "So are you," I said. "Yeah, well." He settled onto the step beside me, closer than he'd sat before, but not close enough to be touching. "I don't have anywhere else I need to be right now." There was something different in his voice today, quieter maybe, or more tired, like he'd used up some reserve of energy since I'd seen him last and was running on whatever was left. "Everything okay?" I asked. He looked at me sideways, one eyebrow raised. "That's a dangerous question to ask someone you barely know." "Is it?" People might actually answer it honestly. The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the sidewalk in front of us. I watched them dance around a fire hydrant before getting caught in the wheels of a passing car, and found myself thinking about the way conversations with Ethan always felt like they were happening on multiple levels at once. "Try me," I said. Ethan was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to wonder if he'd heard me or if he was just choosing to ignore the invitation. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him over the sound of traffic. "Do you know what it's like to be the child of someone whose job it is to fix people?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was particularly shocking, but because of the raw honesty in his tone. Like he'd been carrying it around for a while and had finally found someone safe enough to set it down with. "No," I said simply. "It's weird. Because everyone assumes you must have your shit together, right? Like growing up with a therapist must mean you learned all these healthy coping mechanisms and communication strategies and whatever." He picked up a small stone from the step beside him and turned it over in his fingers. "But really, it just means you know exactly how fucked up you are and exactly why you're fucked up, and you still can't do anything about it." I watched him worry the stone between his thumb and forefinger, noting the way his shoulders had tensed as he spoke. "She's good at what she does," he continued. "Really good. I've seen her help people completely turn their lives around. But with me, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm her son, Or maybe it's because some people are just too broken to fix. But every conversation we have feels like she's trying to therapist me, and I'm trying not to let her, and we both end up frustrated. Is that why you dropped out of graduate school? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted asking. Too personal, too invasive, too much like prying into wounds that were still healing. But Ethan didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, he looked relieved to have someone ask directly instead of dancing around the subject. Partly, he said, I was studying clinical psychology, which in retrospect was probably a mistake. Hard to develop your own approach to therapy when your mother's voice is in your head critiquing every technique you learn. He threw the stone toward the street, watching it skip across the asphalt before disappearing under a parked car. But mostly I dropped out because I realized I was trying to become her, and I didn't actually want to be her. I just wanted her to be proud of me. Something in my chest ached at the resignation in his voice, the way he said it like it was a simple fact rather than a source of pain. Are you sure she's not proud of you? I asked. She's proud of the version of me she thinks I could become if I just tried harder, applied myself more, made better choices. He looked at me then, and I was struck by how young he looked despite the weariness in his eyes. But I don't think she's particularly impressed with who I actually am right now. I wanted to say something comforting, something about how parents often had complicated ways of showing love, about how maybe Dr. Morgan's professional training made it harder for her to separate her maternal instincts from her therapeutic ones. But the words felt hollow before I could even voice them, like platitudes that might be true in theory but didn't address the specific ache of being seen as a project rather than a person. Instead, I said, I think she mentioned you once. Ethan's head turned sharply in my direction. She did? Not by name, but she said something about how change requires letting go of familiar ways of being, even when those ways aren't serving us anymore. And then she got this look on her face like she was thinking about someone specific. I paused, trying to remember the exact moment. It was subtle, but it seemed personal. Like maybe she was thinking about her own experience with watching someone she cares about struggle with change. Huh. Ethan leaned back against the step behind him, processing this information. That's actually kind of surprising. Good surprising or bad surprising? Just surprising. She's usually pretty careful about keeping her personal life separate from her work stuff. We fell into silence again, but it felt different this time. Less charged. More comfortable. Like we'd moved from the shallow end of getting to know each other into slightly deeper water, and neither of us was drowning yet. I should probably go up soon, I said eventually, checking my watch. Session starts in 10 minutes. Yeah. But Ethan didn't move to leave, and neither did I. Can I ask you something? I said. Sure. Why do you come here? To the building, I mean, if things with your mom are complicated. Ethan considered this, his expression thoughtful. Because complicated doesn't mean hopeless, and because... He trailed off, then started again. Because I guess I like seeing people who are trying to get better, even when it's hard, even when they're not sure it's working. There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about the general population of therapy patients. Are you trying to get better? I asked. Some days. He stood up and brushed off the back of his coat. Are you? It was the same question I'd been asking myself for months, the one Dr. Morgan kept circling back to in different forms. The honest answer was that I didn't know. Some days I felt like I was making progress, building healthier patterns, learning to recognize the difference between what I needed and what I thought I deserved. Other days I felt like I was just going through the motions, showing up to sessions because it was Thursday, and that's what I did on Thursdays, not because I believed anything was actually changing. I'm trying to try, I said finally. Ethan nodded like this made perfect sense. That's probably enough for now. He started walking toward the building entrance, then stopped and looked back at me. Marcus? Yeah? After your session, if you don't have anywhere else to be, would you want to walk around for a while? No particular destination, just walking. The invitation hung in the air between us, Casual on the surface, but weighted with the kind of significance that comes from acknowledging that whatever was happening between us was worth pursuing, even if we couldn't name it yet. I should have said no. Should have made some excuse about needing to get home, about having work to do or groceries to buy or any of the dozen small responsibilities that filled up empty evenings. Should have recognized that saying yes meant crossing another line, moving from coincidental encounters to something that looked more like intentional connection. Yeah, I said instead. I'd like that. The session with Dr. Morgan was different that day, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. She seemed more attentive somehow, like she was listening not just to what I was saying, but to what I wasn't saying. We talked about progress, how to measure it, how to maintain it, how to avoid the trap of thinking that healing was supposed to be linear. Change is rarely a straight line, she said at one point, settling back in her chair with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she was prepared to sit with whatever I needed to explore. It's more like waves, maybe, forward motion with occasional pulls backward. That sounds exhausting. It can be, but the alternative, staying exactly where you are, is usually more exhausting in the long run. I thought about this, about the months I'd spent before starting therapy when every day felt like running on a treadmill set too fast, expending enormous amounts of energy to stay in the same place. The work we were doing here was hard, but it was a different kind of hard. Productive, maybe, instead of just punishing. I've been thinking about what you said last week, I said. About expecting the people who claim to love you to actually act like they do. What about it? I think I spent so much time with David trying to earn love that I forgot what it was supposed to feel like when someone actually loved you back. Dr. Morgan leaned forward slightly and I could see the approval in her expression. What do you think it should feel like? Safe, maybe? Like you could mess up or have a bad day or need something and it wouldn't change how they felt about you. I paused, trying to find words for feelings I was only beginning to understand. Like you were allowed to take up space in their life without constantly justifying why you deserve to be there. That sounds like a healthy expectation. It also sounds terrifying. Why? I considered this, trying to trace the source of my discomfort back to its roots. Because it means I'd have to believe I'm worth that kind of love, and I'm not sure I do yet. Dr. Morgan was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler than usual. Sometimes people form attachments outside the room when the ones inside become too hard to face, she said. The words hit me like cold water, sudden and startling. I looked at her sharply, trying to read her expression, but her face was carefully neutral in the way that meant she was working. What are you saying? I asked. I'm not saying anything, but are you? The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to unpack. Did she know about Ethan? Had he mentioned our conversations to her? Or was this just general therapeutic intuition, the kind of insight that came from years of watching people navigate the messy territory between vulnerability and connection? I don't know what you mean, I said, though we both knew I was lying. That's okay. Sometimes we need time to figure out what we're feeling before we can talk about it. The rest of the session passed in a blur of careful deflections and surface-level observations. By the time we wrapped up, I felt like I'd spent an hour trying to navigate a minefield while pretending I was just taking a casual stroll. I'll see you next week, Dr. Morgan said as I gathered my jacket and headed for the door. Yeah, next week. I paused with my hand on the door knee, some instinct telling me there was something else I should say, some acknowledgement of the elephant that had wandered into the room and taken up residence in the corner. But I couldn't find the words, and Dr. Morgan was already turning her attention to the notes on her desk, so I left without saying anything more. Ethan was waiting outside the building when I emerged 20 minutes later, leaning against the same wall where I'd first seen him weeks ago. He'd changed out of the pea coat into his familiar dark hoodie, and there was a cigarette between his fingers that he wasn't smoking, just holding like a prop. How did it go? He asked as I approached. Complicated, I said. Good complicated or bad complicated? I'm not sure yet. He nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable answer, then pushed off from the wall and started walking toward the street. Come on, I know where we're going. I fell into step beside him, noting the way our strides matched naturally despite the difference in our heights. I thought you said no particular destination. I said no particular destination when I didn't know what kind of mood you'd be in after your session, but you look like you need to walk somewhere with purpose, even if the purpose is arbitrary. He was right, though I couldn't have articulated why. There was something about the session, about Dr. Morgan's careful questions and knowing looks, that had left me feeling restless and exposed, like I needed to move to put distance between myself and whatever truth she'd been trying to guide me toward. We walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, through the business district with its glass towers and hurried pedestrians, past coffee shops and bookstores and restaurants that were just beginning to fill up with the dinner crowd. The sky was getting darker, though whether from approaching evening or approaching weather was hard to tell. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said as we paused at a crosswalk. "Seems to be the theme of our conversations. Does she know? About us, I mean. About these, whatever these are." The question I'd been dreading, phrased with characteristic directness. I looked at him, noting the way his jaw was set like he was preparing for an answer he wouldn't like. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe. She said something today about forming attachments outside the therapeutic relationship, but I couldn't tell if she was speaking generally or specifically." Shit. Yeah. We crossed the street and continued walking, both of us lost in our own thoughts about the implications of Dr. Morgan. Knowing versus not knowing, about what it would mean for my therapy and for whatever was developing between us, and for the carefully maintained boundaries that kept professional relationships from bleeding into personal ones. "Would it matter?" I asked eventually. "If she knew?" Ethan was quiet for a long time, long enough that we covered 3 more blocks and passed into a residential area where the buildings were lower and the streetlights were starting to flicker on. "It would matter to her," he said finally. "She takes the professional ethics thing seriously, really seriously." "And to you?" "To me." He trailed off, then stopped walking entirely, turning to face me on the sidewalk of a tree-lined street I didn't recognize. "To me, it matters because it would force us to define what this is, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Most people, in my experience, were eager to label things, to put relationships into neat categories that came with clear expectations and boundaries. But Ethan was asking for the opposite, for space to exist in the undefined territory between strangers and friends, between casual encounters and something more significant. "What do you want it to be?" I asked. "I don't know." He looked up at the darkening sky where clouds were gathering with the promise of rain. "I just know that when I'm with you, I feel like I can say things I don't usually say, and when I'm not with you, I think about the next time I might be." Something in my chest tightened at his words, a combination of fear and recognition and something that might have been relief. Because he was describing exactly what I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to name, the way our conversations felt different from any I'd had with anyone else, the way I found myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons for reasons that had nothing to do with therapy. "That scares me," I said. "Good scared or bad scared?" "Both." A few drops of rain started falling, scattered and tentative at first, but with the promise of more to come. Ethan looked around, then gestured toward a small park across the street where a cluster of trees would provide some shelter. We made it to the park just as the rain began in earnest, taking refuge under a large oak tree whose canopy was thick enough to keep us mostly dry. The park was empty except for us, too late for families with children, too early for the evening joggers, and the sound of rain on leaves created a kind of natural white noise that made the space feel even more isolated. "I should have said no," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Ethan or to myself. "When you asked me to walk with you, I should have said no." "Why?" "Because this is complicated. Because you're her son and she's my therapist, and there are probably rules about this kind of thing that I don't even know exist. Probably. And because I'm not good at complicated. I just got out of something complicated and it nearly broke me." Ethan leaned back against the tree trunk, studying my face in the dim light that filtered through the rain-heavy clouds. "I'm not asking you to be good at complicated," he said. I'm not asking you to be good at anything. I'm just asking you to be here, right now, under this tree, while it rains. The simplicity of the request undid something in my chest, some knot of anxiety I'd been carrying around since the moment I'd first seen him in that hallway. He wasn't asking for promises or definitions or anything beyond this moment, this conversation, this shared space between strangers who were becoming something else entirely. I can't do that, I said. We stood there in comfortable silence, listening to the rain and watching the occasional car pass by on the street beyond the park. There was something peaceful about it, something that reminded me of being a kid and finding unexpected moments of calm in the middle of chaos. Marcus? Ethan's voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain. Yeah? I didn't ask you to let me in. The words hung in the air between us, not an accusation but a statement of fact that felt like it required some kind of response. No, I said, but I did. When the rain finally stopped, we walked back toward the building where both of our cars were parked. The streets were slick and reflective under the streetlights, and the air smelled clean in the way it only does after a good rain. We didn't talk much, both of us seemingly content to exist in the quiet space that had opened up between us during our time under the tree. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I realized how late it had gotten. The building was dark except for the security lights, and most of the cars that had been there earlier were gone. I should get home, I said, though I made no move toward my car. Yeah, me too. But neither of us moved. We stood there in the empty parking lot, the space between us charged with the weight of everything we'd shared and everything we hadn't shared, everything we wanted to say and everything we were afraid to say. Same time next week? Ethan asked eventually. For the session? For whatever comes after. I looked at him, noting the way the parking lot lights caught the angles of his face, the way his hands were shoved deep in his pockets like he was trying to keep them from doing something he shouldn't. There were a dozen reasons why I should say no, why I should end this before it became something I couldn't control or understand. Yeah, I said instead. Same time next week. 3 days later, I was sitting in my apartment trying to focus on work when there was a knock at my door. It was just after 9 p.m. on a Sunday, too late for deliveries and too early for emergencies, and I couldn't think of anyone who might be dropping by unannounced. I opened the door to find Ethan standing in the hallway, soaked through from rain I hadn't even realized was falling. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and water was dripping from the hem of his jacket onto the worn carpet of my building's corridor. Jesus, you're soaked, I said, stepping back to let him in. Sorry for just showing up. I was walking and I ended up here and He trailed off, looking around my apartment like he was trying to figure out how to explain his presence. It's okay. Do you want a towel? Dry clothes? A towel would be good. I disappeared into my bedroom and came back with the largest towel I could find, along with a hooded sweatshirt that would probably be too big for him but would at least be warm and dry. He was still standing by the door, dripping onto my hardwood floors, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. Here, I said, handing him the towel, and there's a bathroom down the hall if you want to change into something dry. When he came back 10 minutes later, his hair was towel-dried and chaotic, and he was wearing my sweatshirt, which was indeed too big for him in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable than usual. He'd rolled the sleeves up to reveal his hands, and I found myself staring at his fingers for longer than was probably appropriate. Better? I asked. Yeah, thanks. He settled onto my couch without being invited, which should have felt presumptuous but somehow didn't. Nice place. I looked around my apartment, trying to see it through his eyes. It was small but comfortable, decorated in the kind of neutral tones that suggested someone who'd recently had to start over and hadn't quite figured out what their own taste looked like yet. The furniture was mostly second-hand, acquired piece by piece as I'd realized I needed things like a coffee table and bookshelves and lamps that weren't the overhead fluorescents that had come with the place. It's getting there, I said, still figuring out what I want it to look like. How long have you lived here? About 6 months. I moved in after... I gestured vaguely, not sure how to finish the sentence. After David. Yeah, after David. Ethan nodded like this made sense, then looked around the room again with more attention to detail. I found myself wondering what he was seeing, whether the space read as lonely or peaceful, whether the careful distance between personal items suggested someone who was healing or someone who was afraid to get too attached to anything. "Can I ask why you were walking around in the rain?" I said, settling into the chair across from him. "Couldn't sleep. Sometimes walking helps." He pulled his feet up onto the couch, tucking them under him in a way that made the already too big sweatshirt look even more oversized. "And I was thinking about what you said, about letting me in." Something in my chest tightened. "What about it?" "I keep thinking about how you said it like it was a mistake, like something you shouldn't have done." I considered this, trying to separate what I actually thought from what I thought I should think, what felt true from what felt safe. "I don't know if it was a mistake," I said slowly, "but it wasn't exactly a choice either. It just happened. Most of the important things do." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that had become familiar between us. Outside, the rain continued in a steady rhythm that made my apartment feel even more separate from the rest of the world, like we were in a bubble where normal rules and expectations didn't quite apply. "Are you cold?" I asked, noticing the way Ethan had pulled his knees up to his chest. "A little." I got up and retrieved the throw blanket from the back of my couch, a soft gray thing that had been one of my first purchases for this place because it had seemed like the kind of item that would make anywhere feel more like home. I started to hand it to him, then stopped, some instinct making me pause with the blanket in my hands. "Here," I said, moving to sit beside him on the couch. "Let me—" I wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, my hands brushing against his arms as I arranged the fabric. He was warmer than I'd expected, despite having been caught in the rain, and I could smell the clean scent of my soap on his skin where he'd washed the rain away. Our faces were closer than they'd ever been, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes, close enough that I could count his eyelashes if I wanted to, close enough that if either of us moved forward even slightly, we'd be crossing a line we hadn't crossed yet. Neither of us moved. But we didn't move away either. My hands were still on his shoulders where I'd been adjusting the blanket, and his eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made it hard to remember why maintaining distance was supposed to be important. The space between us felt charged, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. "Marcus," he said quietly, and my name sounded different in his voice than it ever had before. "Yeah?" But whatever he'd been about to say was lost when my phone rang, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet of the room. We both jumped slightly, the moment broken, and I moved away to answer it, even though the last thing I wanted to do was deal with whatever crisis or mundane interruption was waiting on the other end of the line. It was my mother calling to ask about Thanksgiving plans that were still 6 weeks away. I spent 10 minutes reassuring her that yes, I was fine, yes, I was eating enough, no, I wasn't working too much, while Ethan sat on my couch wrapped in my blanket and pretended to be interested in the books on my shelves. By the time I hung up, the spell of whatever had been happening between us was thoroughly broken. Ethan had pulled the blanket more securely around himself, and there was careful distance in his posture that hadn't been there before. "I should probably go," he said, though he made no move to get up. "You don't have to. The rain's still coming down pretty hard." "I know, but I should." I wanted to ask him to stay, wanted to suggest we watch a movie or order food or just sit here and talk until the rain stopped and the sun came up and we had to return to the normal world where he was Dr. Morgan's son and I was Dr. Morgan's patient, and whatever was happening between us was complicated in ways we couldn't solve by wanting it to be simpler. Instead, I said, "Okay." He stood up and started to remove the blanket, but I stopped him. "Keep it," I said, "until you get home. You can give it back later." He nodded, then walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Marcus?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me in, literally and otherwise." After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the spot on the couch where he'd been sitting and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Not the almost moment when our faces had been too close and our hands had lingered too long that I understood. even if I didn't know what to do about it. But the ease with which he'd appeared at my door, the way he'd settled into my space like he belonged there, the fact that I'd wanted him to stay even when I knew it was probably the wrong thing to want. I was in trouble, real trouble. The kind that started with good intentions and ended with people getting hurt in ways they hadn't seen coming. The following Thursday, I arrived at Dr. Morgan's office 15 minutes late, a rarity that I blamed on traffic, but that was actually due to the fact that I'd spent 20 minutes sitting in my car trying to decide whether to come at all. The conversation with Ethan on Sunday had left me feeling exposed and uncertain, like I was walking around with a secret that was too big for me to carry but too complicated to share. Doctor Morgan didn't comment on my lateness, just settled into her chair and waited for me to find my equilibrium. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. It was her standard opening question, the therapeutic equivalent of "how's the weather?" But today it felt loaded with significance, like she was asking about something specific rather than just checking in. "Different," I said before I could think about whether that was the answer I wanted to give. "Different how?" I considered this, trying to find words for the restlessness that had been building in my chest all week, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through the world. "Like I'm standing on the edge of something," I said finally, "but I don't know if it's a cliff or a diving board." Dr. Morgan leaned forward slightly, the way she did when I said something that caught her professional attention. "That sounds both exciting and terrifying." "It is." "What do you think brought on this feeling?" And there it was, the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I could lie, give her some vague answer about work stress or seasonal depression or any of the dozen small anxieties that filled up my days. But we'd spent months building trust, establishing patterns of honesty that had slowly made it possible for me to tell the truth about harder and harder things. "I think I'm developing feelings for someone," I said. "That's wonderful." Her response was immediate and genuine, and I realized I'd been expecting judgment or concern rather than approval. "What's concerning you about it?" "Where do I even start? The fact that it's your son? The fact that I met him here in this building because of our professional relationship? The fact that I don't know how to separate what I'm feeling from the work we're doing together?" "It's complicated," I said instead. "Most meaningful connections are. This is more complicated than most." Dr. Morgan was quiet for a moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than I wanted her to see. "Do you want to tell me about them?" she asked. The pronoun felt significant, carefully chosen to avoid assumptions about gender or identity. It was the kind of thoughtful inclusivity I'd come to expect from her, but today it felt like she was giving me space to share something she already knew. "I don't think I can," I said. "Not yet." "Because it's too new, or because it's too complicated?" "Both. And because I'm not sure it's appropriate to discuss in therapy." This seemed to get her attention in a way that my previous responses hadn't. She set down her pen and looked at me directly, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something more personal. "Marcus, is there something you need to tell me? About boundaries or conflicts of interest or anything that might affect our work together?" The question hung in the air between us, direct and unavoidable. This was my chance to tell her about Ethan, to acknowledge what had been developing between us and let her guide me through the ethical and emotional complexities of the situation. Instead, I said, "No, nothing like that." It wasn't technically a lie. Nothing had actually happened between Ethan and me, nothing that crossed any clear professional boundaries or violated any explicit rules. But it felt like a lie, and from the way Dr. Morgan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, I suspected she knew it was a lie too. "Okay," she said after a long pause. "But if that changes, I need you to tell me, for both of our sakes." The rest of the session passed in a blur of careful deflections and surface-level explorations. We talked about my feelings about developing new relationships, about my fears of repeating old patterns, about the difference between healthy vulnerability and emotional dependency, all relevant topics, all useful discussions. But I felt like I was participating from behind a glass wall, present but not fully engaged. When the session ended, Dr. Morgan walked me to the door as she sometimes did, but this time she paused before opening it. "You look lighter today,"